Wait, you have a TV?
No. I just like to read the TV guide. Read the TV guide. You don't need a TV.
Television addict! Television addict! Television addict!
Hey everybody, welcome to TV Guidance Counselor. I am Ken Reed, your TV Guidance Counselor, the Boston stand-up comedian who's welcomed a guest each and every week since 2014 to the show to discuss classic television using back issues of TV Guide magazine from my personal collection as the gateway into our collective past. And I am incredibly excited for my guest this week. My guest is the one and only John Sayles. If for some strange reason you don't know who John Sayles is, stop this podcast right now and look him up and look up his work. He is a writer, an actor, a novelist, a screenwriter, a director, and also just a good dude and a fascinating guy. He spent some real time with this, and I am honored and flattered, and you will be very excited to hear this episode, as I am excited to present this episode to you, and as I was excited to record this episode. You can email me at tvguidancecounselor@gmail.com or ken@icanread.com with your thoughts, guest suggestions, whatever you may have. I love hearing from you guys. Let me know what you thought of this show. Let me know what you're watching. Let me know how you're doing. But in the meantime, please sit back, relax, and enjoy this week's episode of TV Guidance Counselor with my guest, the one, the only, Mr. John Sayles.
TV is my friend, and it has been always there for me in time of need.
Live via satellite, John Sayles. How are you, sir?
I'm good. It's a little cold up here on the satellite, but other than that.
It is, and the atmosphere isn't great either.
No.
Oh, but I'm bumching. Yeah, I could really, can tell I haven't done stand-up in a long time.
Yeah.
Damn you, COVID. I was very excited that you were interested in doing the show because I've enjoyed so much of the work that you've done. And I know you're a well-versed fan of so much stuff that sort of you've talked about that incorporates into your work. So when you sent me your list of shows you watched, a lot of it just made perfect sense to me.
Yeah. I think in my generation, TV was kind of a babysitter. And so I got to watch a lot of it. My brother and I, and mostly my parents both worked. And so they were kind of fried by the time they got home. And, it was rare that they sat down and watched anything with us, which was fine with us because, we had control. I am assuming, I chose June 3rd, 1960. I'm assuming this is far before you were born.
It was. I was born in 1980. But as a young lad, I had horrible insomnia and I slept maybe 2 hours a night. And my parents did not supervise me at all. Yeah. So I was up watching, Night Flight on USA Network and all the weird, UHF stations at like 3, 4, 5. And
those are like night commercials that go with them.
Yes, absolutely. Stuff that I had no business watching, but I feel like made me a better person.
Yeah. Just as a groundation, in 1960, I was 10 years old. There were only 3 channels, CBS, NBC, and ABC. PBS hadn't really kind of raised its head yet. I think it may have been called something like ETV, educational TV or something like that, but it wasn't all over the country. Color existed in TV, but we had a black and white TV. I didn't see a show in color until I was in college.
Do you remember what the first show was?
It was a baseball game. I said, boy, the grass is green on the baseball game. That's incredible. I had seen them like in a Western Electric, store window, but I hadn't actually sat down. There was even, Walt Disney's A Wonderful World of Color to rub it into us, didn't have color TVs. And there were no remotes. So if you wanted to change to a different of those 3 channels, you had to get your butt out of the couch and walk 4 or 5 feet and actually flip the dial around. And there were like 12 or 13 clicks on the dial. So
Oh,
there
yeah.
was there was stuff, with static in between the channels that you wanted.
That's why people had more than one child.
Yeah.
We have a remote that we made that can turn this. And obesity wasn't a problem as much because people had to get up to turn the channel.
Yeah. Oh, actually, you did many laps going from one to the other. Saturday night, one thing to remind, as I go down this list, in 1960, there were 30 Westerns
Wow.
on television, on 3 networks. So that was the dominant genre. There were detective things were starting to come in. There were a lot of kind of holdovers from the Playhouse 90 thing. So there was like Zane Grey Theater or whatever. Somebody would present something and it would be a different story each week. But the Western, and I don't know, it's part of the American psyche, and it's part of the reason that we're fucked up, probably.
Yeah, for sure.
This idea that, we're that lone gunman who can come into town and solve everybody's problems with a few well-placed bullets,
Right.
Which works better on the Western Village model than it does in, Middle Eastern countries, let's say. My first Saturday one is Have Gun Will Travel, which was, to stand out from each other, you had to find another twist on the Western. So this one is Richard Boone, who was, kind of a serious actor. He'd mostly played heavies in early movies. In The Big Sleep with Humphrey Bogart.
Love that
he
movie.
plays a character named Lash Canino.
I knew so many Lash Caninos growing up. That was just
Exactly. But in this one, he plays this very refined guy. He lives in a hotel in San Francisco. He's a dandy. He's on the board of trade. He drinks fine wines and wears lacy shirts. And but he has this card that he hands out. Have Gun Will Travel, and there's a chess piece on it, which is the horse, and his name is Paladin. He's a knight without armor, and he's hireable. And if you're just some rich guy who wants something done where you need some heavy weight, you pay a lot. But if you're poor and in need, he might show up and do it gratis. He's a kind of pro bono gunfighter. And a lot of these guys did that. They're bounty hunters or whatever. But if somebody's in trouble, they're also social workers,
Right.
With good aim. And he carried, and they all had a kind of distinct thing. Their weapons were distinct. And this guy carried a 45 caliber Colt single action Army cavalry model revolver with a very unusual rifled barrel. So it's kind of distinctive looking, and a Derringer. He's also a fencing master.
Of course.
And there are scenes of him in San Francisco getting kung fu lessons from Chinese guys. So he's like the all purpose, weapon.
Historically accurate.
And then on the job, he wears black, which was unusual for the good guys. And then important to all these Westerns especially, but all of these shows is the theme song here.
A gun will travel, reach the card of a man. A knight without armor in a savage land. His vast gun for hire heeds the calling wind. A soldier of fortune is the man called Paladin. Paladin, Paladin, where do you roam?
That was sung by a guy named Johnny Western, I assume not his birth name. And it became quite a hit. And so all of these, these themes it's a half-hour show. As a TV writer, what you know about a half-hour show is you're filling 22 minutes with the music in and the music out and the credits and about 8 minutes of commercials. So you got to tell your story pretty quickly, and in kind of broad strokes and everything like that. And that lead-in is really part of the juice of the show and the mood of the show, and it kind of sets the tone. And this is one of the better ones. Next show I would have watched on that night, Wanted Dead or Alive, and you've probably seen this. This is Steve McQueen before he was a movie star. Mm-hmm. At this point, I think he'd been in The Blob, the original Blob,
world's oldest teenager in The Blob.
Yeah, he plays Josh Randall, who's a bounty hunter. And he carries a sawed-off Winchester rifle in a holster. So this very strange. And they're actually, this was something that some people had in the Old West. It was known as a mare's leg, but you draw it like a pistol, but it's it has a better range. Hard to sit down at a bar counter or anything, one of those on your hip. And the thing about him, that just struck you right away with Steve McQueen is that, he didn't have as much dialogue as, for instance, Paladin did, but he was one of the best physical actors who's ever graced any screen. He just moved cool. And that, held him in good stead in his later movie career. And he was one of those guys like Charles Bronson who would just take a script and cross out lines. Right. And I'm cool. Yeah. I just got to move across the screen and, jack this guy up, and that's enough.
Still waters run deep there.
Yeah. And the last one they have listed here on Saturday night is Ernie Kovacs. This is a show that was usually on earlier where I lived in Schenectady, New York. So I imagine it's reruns. Ernie Kovacs had this very bizarre sense of humor. He's this guy from Buffalo, big face like a catcher's mitt. He was only in a couple movies and very good in them. He was in Our Man in Havana playing like a Cuban torturer or something like that.
It's kind of perfect.
And what was strange about this is it had no laugh track. So there's all these comedy bits, included silent ones with music and stuff like that, and no laugh track. And at that time, I Love Lucy is the big show. And, you could recognize a show by its laugh track. Oh, that's I Love Lucy from the next room. So when I saw it, the humor was so strange. And without the laugh track, it was kind of like pornography. I didn't like to look at it if my parents were in the room. I'd switch the channel because I wasn't sure I was supposed to be watching it. And the thing I remember the most about that is they would often just go into this, a number of sight gags, while on the track, Lotta Lenya would be singing Mac the Knife in German.
Yes.
So it's really trippy. And this is way before LSD, or I certainly wasn't doing any drugs in those days. And that would be Saturday night. So you're starting with Westerns. And then if this is on, there's this bizarre, from another planet kind of comedy.
Yeah, Ernie Kovacs is one of those guys that he was doing comedy that understood how television worked. I think for the first time he was really using the medium to sort of make the jokes and the gags something unique. It wasn't just radio stuff like the Nairobi Trio. That's the classic one with no laugh track that is sort of scary, but also funny.
Oh, it was bizarre. He did a thing. There was a character named Eugene who was this schlubby guy, and it was all done with sound effects. And there was no dialogue, and he'd come and he'd do things that were funny. And he did one where he built a tilted stage and put a table on it and nailed a few things down. And the guy comes and tries to eat his lunch, and they tilted the camera too. So to the audience, it looks like it's, horizontally flat. But every time he takes an orange out, it rolls off the table. And he tries to pour milk into his glass, and it overshoots it. I mean, really very kind of visionary stuff. Sunday night, once again, started with a Western, which was The Rebel. This is an actor named Nick Adams, who was this like Ukrainian kid from the coal mining regions of Pennsylvania originally, as Johnny Yuma, who's this guy who's riding around the West after the Civil War, still wearing his Confederate uniform.
Of course.
Because he's got a death wish. And it's kind of, he was a method actor, and so it's kind of like somebody from the Beat generation who's been reading Jack Kerouac, riding into town wearing a Confederate uniform, carrying a sawed-off shotgun, so he means business, and just about asking for a fight. He's moody. He was very good at being moody. And he was kind of a piece of work, Mick Adams. He was in Rebel Without a Cause, in a couple pretty good movies, and then he started doing real shocking movies. But he was a real kind of wannabe. He hung out with James Dean, and Dennis Hopper was a big friend of his. After James Dean died, he's hung out with Elvis a lot. He became part of Elvis's crew.
Memphis Mafia guy.
Yeah, and they drive motorcycles together and stuff like that. He eventually OD'd on prescription drugs when he was fairly young.
Which is weird because this episode, if you read the description, Johnny learns that an old friend from his army days has become a drug addict.
Yes, even in the Old West.
Yes.
And then the theme song was sung by some new country western guy.
Away, 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 run the rebel Johnny Yuma.
Johnny Yuma was a rebel. He roamed through the West, and Johnny Yuma was a rebel. He wandered alone. He got fighting mad, this rebel lad. He packed no star as he wandered far, where the only law was a hook and a draw. The rebel.
Away, away, rode the rebel.
Johnny Yuma was a rebel. He roamed through the West, and Johnny Yuma was a rebel. He wandered alone. He searched the land, this restless lad. He was panther quick and leather tough, 'cause he figured that he'd been pushed enough. The rebel, Johnny Yuma. Johnny Yuma was a rebel. He roamed through the West, and Johnny Yuma, the rebel, he wandered alone. He was fighting mad, this rebel lad.
This is the first I ever heard Johnny Cash. And, I think he was like taking extra testosterone when he sang that.
It's real low.
And a lot of his, and that became a hit, and got some airtime. Once you had that intro, you're kind of in the mood, in a later, kind of, I think it was 70s, Hawaii Five-0 had that great
Yeah.
And I used to just watch the intro, and I didn't like the series. So I would then switch to whatever was opposite it, but I never missed the intro, the bongos and all that kind of stuff. Then the other thing, next thing I would watch would be Alfred Hitchcock Presents. And Alfred Hitchcock Presents were kind of macabre, little half-hour tales with kind of ironic, grisly endings to them, with that kind of Hitchcock touch to them. He did not direct any of them that I remember, but he was the host. And they were two kind of notable things about it. The producer for many of them was Norman Lloyd, who was this wonderful character actor who just died this year at like 103 years old and was compos mentis until the end. He's the guy in Saboteur whose sleeve rips and he falls off the Statue of Liberty, and he worked with Jean Renoir and all this. And he had been blacklisted. And Hitch, who liked working with him, said, well, look, they're not going to blacklist you from being a producer, just an actor. And so gave him a good paying gig for years and years and years. And the other thing was, the most fun in the show was that the introductions were done by very tongue-in-cheek by Hitchcock himself. Mm-hmm. The theme was the Funeral March of the Marionettes, which was kind of semi-classical.
playful and creepy that almost like,
Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of people have seen Alfred Hitchcock Presents, but if they haven't, the trailer for Psycho is essentially an opening of an Alfred Hitchcock Presents for the movie Psycho. The tone is very different
kind
from
of
the movie.
wry,
Yeah.
and and in that very kind of British way of we actually really love murder.
Yes,
And
yeah.
or,
Isn't it fun?
There's an old British joke about the newspaper reporting on a murder and just saying, well, the woman was found, with her head separated from her body, and she was eviscerated, and, one leg was found in this county and another one was found in this county, and that the forensic people have ascertained that the young woman was not interfered with.
She kept her dignity there.
Yeah.
Did you ever get to meet any of these guys when you were...
No. Unfortunately, by the time I started working for the movies, most of these guys were gone. Later on, I'll get to Robert Stack, who I did get to, which was cool. The last one on that night, oh no, not the last one, Johnny Staccato, which is like the greatest name for a detective series.
Fantastic.
It's kind of like Sex, Lies, and Videotape. You're going to get people to watch. Which starred John Cassavetes, very young, as a former jazz pianist, as he says, his chops weren't that good, so he had to hand in his union card and get a detective's license.
As one does.
And he works out of Greenwich Village, hangs out in a club called Waldo's, which is owned by this character actor named Eduardo Cianelli, who's this very light blue-eyed Italian-American actor who usually played mafia dons. And it has this real film noir look and a lot of narration from Cassavetes, which, once again, if you're writing a half-hour show, it does a lot of work for you.
Mm-hmm.
You can explain half the plot. And the theme, once again, is a great theme. And it was written by Elmer Bernstein, so a wonderful, movie composer who did things like the theme to The Magnificent Seven, which later became the Marlboro Cigarettes theme.
Of course.
And here's Elmer Bernstein's theme.
It's so aggressive. It's almost too weird to be like a Peter Gunn kind of smooth.
Yeah, and what's, of course, it being, only 1960, the house band is all these West Coast jazz guys, Shelly Mann's the drummer, and they're all white.
Yeah, of course.
That was that. And then finally, Sunday night ended with the Ed Sullivan Show. And the Ed Sullivan Show, there were variety shows in there. Perry Como had one, and they were usually an hour long. And you had this, you had acrobats on, you had stand-up comedians on, you had singers, famous and not famous singing songs. You had scenes from Broadway plays sometimes. He would introduce, the Harlem Globetrotters,
Right.
Chamberlain, or whoever had, just won an Olympic gold medal. He had been a sports columnist who then became an entertainment columnist in New York City. And then he just kind of was, I'm the toast of Broadway guy, and I'm bringing you the best of Broadway and who's in town. My favorite act, because once again, it was like Ernie Kovacs. It was so bizarre of, why are people watching this? Was a group called Johnny Puleo and the Harmonica Gang.
Oh, yeah.
Go online and look at these guys. Johnny Puleo was this little Italian guy who in those days would have been called a midget. And then there were like 5 or 6 really guys with really long legs they all played harmonicas, usually playing a very upbeat version of Hold That Tiger.
Yes.
And then he would play, and then when they'd finished, he'd come over and bite Ed Sullivan on the ankle.
There's an SCTV episode where they do a parody of Ocean's 11 with Sammy Maudlin, and the Harmonica Gang is in it. It's the weirdest thing. It's like 1980 or 81.
Yeah.
And clearly they grew, because it's supposed to take place in the 60s, and, you know, and it's so bizarre because they're probably 70 something at this point in this thing. And it's just out of context. So weird.
It helped watching that show, SCTV. It helped to have watched as much TV as I had and movies because it's so referential. My favorite bizarre bit of theirs was a children's cartoon show hosted by Old Muley, who's a character in the movie they made of Grapes of Wrath, who's this guy who's stayed on even though his farm has been, you know, kind of burned down and there's just dust everywhere. And he's this kind of, you know, mopey guy. And, you know, kids don't like Old Muley. You know. They don't even want to hear him say anything. Here's another cartoon.
That's where I learned that stuff, which is funny. I got this sort of, you know, the generation of people who started making television that grew up on television and started doing this sort of one step removed stuff. That's how I sort of the Mad Magazine, learning through parody
going
things.
Backwards. Oh, yeah. Ed Sullivan eventually he introduced the Beatles to the United States. They were on his show, and eventually the Rolling Stones and stuff like that. And of course, they're lip syncing, but the screaming, he made pretend that he wanted them to calm down. And I saw that night, and I also saw a great night where somehow whoever had to hit the censor button wasn't quick enough. There was a wonderful comedian named Jackie Mason, and Jackie Mason was a real Borscht Belt guy, and he was going over, his allotted time, which was probably 2 minutes and 13 seconds, or maybe 3 minutes and 16 seconds, and they were giving him the signal to hurry up, and he went, "Oh, you got a signal for me? I got a signal for you and for you." And he's flipping the bird. And they got like 2 or 3 of them in before they cut away. I think to a commercial for, hairspray or something like that.
I don't know if you looked at the lineup here on this one, but it's Count Basie and his orchestra with Joe Williams, Charles Chaplin Jr.
Yeah, who I never heard of.
Me either. Professor Backwards. Musical comedy star Cheetah Rivers, comedian Gene Carroll, and the comedy team of Ford and Reynolds, the High Lads, the comedy vocal quartet, and the Ducats.
Yeah. And I don't remember half of those. There were people who were on it like 20 times. I worked with a stand-up guy named Alan King, who was also an actor, and he was on it a lot. But they always did the same damn act. This is before, everybody had an iPhone and could steal your act and it would be on the web the next day. And you would just wait a year and you have the same guy on and, I like that routine. Do that again.
Yeah. People forgot.
So people forgot. And what it meant when that show was ending is you got this sick feeling in your stomach because you had to go to bed and tomorrow was Monday morning and you had to get behind the mule and go back to school.
Yep. The Sunday scaries.
I had a very bittersweet, oh God, this is it. It's curtains, Ed Sullivan Show was ending. Monday, this is getting back to these kind of jazzy TV shows. There was Peter Gunn. And Peter Gunn was played by a guy named Craig Stevens. And he was a show created by Blake Edwards, who later became a very successful director. He did all those Peter Sellers as Inspector Clouseau movies. And, he was married to, what's her name, who played Mary Poppins. And he was not a musician, but he hung out at a jazz club called Mother's. And a lot of the same white jazz players on the West Coast were in the band.
Coincidentally.
The same drummer and stuff like that. Including the pianist was a guy who later became Steven Spielberg composer, John Williams.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
All the jazzy piano riffs on it, and he was obviously a young guy, and it was a good gig. And then this had the most classic opening that even if you didn't like the show, you watched the opening.
This was to the point where I think The Art of Noise and Duane Eddy had a top 10 hit with a remake of this in the late 80s when this show hadn't aired even in reruns in decades, but the song kept going.
You can imagine every garage band, because of that great guitar line.
Oh, yeah.
And very often, if they had a keyboard, all the horns would be done by a guy on electric organ. Keyboards weren't very sophisticated back then, but you could at least do those sustained notes on an electric organ. And, you know, it was, once again, it was a half-hour show, and so you had to be very, very efficient. And I can't remember the plot of any of these episodes on any of these shows because they were so kind of generic.
Right.
And there was something comforting about that. You know, there was an arc to them. Usually you'd go back to the club at the end and they'd play some more jazzy music.
Yeah, it was not ambiguous at all. We started to see that a little bit later, like in the mid to late 60s when we started getting stuff like Branded or, you know, The Prisoner and that stuff. But at this point, it's very black and white. Were you the kind of kid that was dissecting these? Like, were you learning structure and stories just by watching them, maybe not even knowingly?
Yeah. Well, until the late 60s, and you start to get Sergio Leone movies coming here, and, they don't shave every day, and they sweat, you know, and bounty hunters are just kind of scummy guys. Things changed a little bit, especially in Westerns. That anti-hero had not hit the planet yet, at least not Planet USA. Next was another Western, Tales of Wells Fargo, which was a guy with another great deep voice, Dale Robertson, who was also, he was one of the intro guys and narrators on a series, brought to you by 22 Real Team Borax. And in this one, he plays Jim Hardy, who was a left-handed gun, which I like because I'm left-handed. And he's not just a cowboy, he's a special agent for the Wells Fargo company, which was already a banking and stage company. If you see their logo, it's still got the stage coaches in them. So he does a lot of he can pretend to be a bad guy for a while and then turn out to be a good guy in order to get he's a Western detective.
Undercover bounty hunter. Yeah.
We lived in Santa Barbara for a while when I started working for the movies, and Wells Fargo was my bank, and I had stagecoaches on the checks, which was very cool. And then the last one on Monday night was a show that I would watch like 5 or 10 minutes because I just, what's going on here? It was called Adventures in Paradise. It was based on some stories by James Michener, who usually wrote these great big fat things. And he had wrote the stories because he was stationed in the South Pacific during World War II. That South Pacific, the musical, was based on, and he wrote things like Alaska, and it would be 500 pages. I should talk. I write books. And it starred a guy named Gardner McKay, who was very upfront about, I am not an actor. And I never really wanted to be an actor, but he was so good looking that the show got good ratings for at least the first year because women wanted to tune in and see this guy sailing around Tahiti. And as far as I could remember, that's mostly what he did. He did a lot of sailing. with not that many shorts on and stuff like that. So he looked good. And he very shortly after the series got canceled, after maybe 2 years, he just quit and became an artist who lived in interesting places and had lions.
That's not bad.
Yeah. He was famous for showing up at parties with a lion on a leash.
Oh, he's that guy.
Yeah.
It's like the guy who shows up with a guitar to a party, and then the guy who shows up with a lion. Ricardo Montauban is in that episode as well.
Yes, well, he looks good in a Hawaiian shirt.
Absolutely.
And he has a permanent tan, Ricardo Montauban.
Yes, indeed.
He's actually a pretty good actor. If you see some movies from the late 40s, when he was a young guy, it's surprising because sometimes he's the lead in them. Mm-hmm. And he's this Hispanic guy who's not totally white and everything. And he was very charming and everything. Later on TV and Love Boat Days, he seemed like a retired actor.
He's phoning it in.
Who's still in front, but a comfortable guy.
Yeah.
And more like the host of the show than acting in it. On Tuesday, there was a comedy show called Dobie Gillis, which was a real piece of Americana. It's about this kind of regular American teenager who just can't get a date, and he's a nice guy, and he's a crew cut blonde kid, and his best friend, the actor who played him, Dwayne Hickman, had a brother, Daryl, who was a twin brother who also acted. His best friend is a beatnik, a totally bearded beatnik called Maynard J. Krebs, somehow still going to an American high school, even though he looked about 30. And it was played by Bob Denver, who later was Gilligan on Gilligan's Island. And I remember it's one of the first things I noticed about a transition. They did a verbal transition on this, which, there are jump cuts and there are swish pan cuts like they used on The Man from U.N.C.L.E. And this was a verbal cut, which they would have somebody else in a scene and a sentence with the word work. And then they'd cut to Maynard J. Krebs going, work, as if, his hair was standing on an end. And
right.
The word itself could make him, quell. And early, the first year of this was interesting because Warren Beatty was on it, as well as Tuesday Weld. And there's some great stuff online of scenes between the two of them. And they're so good looking.
Yes.
His character eventually got, replaced by a guy who played Chatsworth Osborne III, who was the rich kid.
Right.
By a wonderful, obnoxious actor.
It's very similar to Archie. It's sort of like, I think it's around the same time as Archie, but it's that similar sort of high school archetypes.
I think they probably had Archie in mind, just as a later series that was Route 66.
Yes.
Was a guy who wanted to buy On the Road from Jack Kerouac, and the guy wouldn't sell it. He says, well, I'll do my own version. But instead of, hopheads, we'll have one guy who's like working class hophead, and then the other's like a rich guy who has a Corvette.
Totally different thing.
So they have a really nice car that's convertible instead of a piece of Detroit shit. After this came The Rifleman, another Western, with Chuck Connors, who was this big, tall, I think he played in the
Celtics,
Angeles Dodgers. He may have come up for a cup of coffee and played in the majors for a couple games, playing Lucas McCain. And Johnny Crawford played his son, Mark. And there was always a line during it where, son, have you done your chores? And I was so glad that I didn't have chores that included slopping hogs and, mending barbed wire. I had things I could do at 10 years old already, but none of them were chores like that kid had to do before. And they weren't television. So after you did your chores, what was, let's go into town and see my father shoot somebody.
Buy some gingham.
Yeah. And Lucas McCain carried this kind of trick rifle that you could kind of jack the lever and get off a lot of shots. And that was the introduction of just watching his hand on the lever of this thing, blowing somebody away. After that was M Squad. And this is a show most people don't remember. this starred Lee Marvin as Lieutenant Frank Ballinger, who was, the head of a Chicago special unit, for the Chicago cops. Much of it shot in Chicago.
Oh, wow.
He carried 2 Colt snub-nosed revolvers. He was the first cop on TV to have a backup. These were, probably because the real Chicago cops were carrying them.
Yeah.
I think he's carried his in the back of his pants, not in his, in his shoe or anything like that. And there was an interesting incident that happened with one of the episodes had, and this will be hard to believe, a corrupt Chicago cop in it.
What?
Mayor Daley, who was kind of, later notorious in Chicago, got so upset by this, he banned TV and movies from shooting in Chicago for years.
Wow.
And they had to recreate things in LA on the studio, which I'm sure was even cheaper for them. But that ban, for several years, nothing was shot in Chicago because somebody had the effrontery to suggest that one of Chicago's finest might be corrupt.
This sounds like almost like the not real life because it's a TV show, but the contemporary version of like Crime Story. The 80s show.
And that was Chicago, and that was Michael Mann.
Yep.
And it had guys with real Chicago accents,
right.
Being one of them. And this had a wonderful theme that was by Count Basie. And
wow.
Count Basie took a riff, I think, from Night Train, which is kind of a famous stripper song. And he did this great theme.
Which Police Squad really...
Well, let me say, here we have Police Squad.
Police Squad in color.
They didn't go too far, just enough to not get sued.
Starring Leslie Nielsen.
And I'm sure they watched M Squad episodes.
Oh, no doubt about it.
At the same kind of narration.
Did Joe Dante direct a couple of episodes of Police
He
Squad?
did some of the early TV episodes of Police Squad, before it became the Naked Gun ones, which was only lasted about 6 episodes.
Yeah.
And the network didn't get it. And they're wonderful. They're really
so bizarre and surreal and like stuff you can't believe they even got on the air.
My favorite bit was that at the end, it was supposed to be such a cheap show that when they ran the credits, everybody just froze.
Yeah.
And like the perpetrator who was in the room would look around and realize, well, I don't have to freeze, and he'd stop her outside. Yeah. The other thing I remember about this show is that most of the ads were for Pall Mall cigarettes, and Lee Marvin did them.
Oh, wow.
Smoking and talking. This is still, heavy cigarette days, when people, even the news people smoked.
Doctors.
Yeah, exactly. I'm a cigarette man, not a medical man. And he smoked quite a bit during the show as well. Wednesday night had an hour show called Wagon Train. And that was a big Western. Each episode was the so-and-so story. And, with an hour, you have a different format. You can really tell, you probably got 45 minutes to tell your stories. You can take your time and then, and there's a lot of soap opera to it, but usually it was a different guest star every week. And then they would have some problem to work out while they're going westward. And the Wagon Master in 60 was still played by Ward Bond, who, if you look at his filmography, was in like 300 movies. He was in almost every John Ford movie, Western, ever made. And he died later in this year, in November of 1960, and was replaced by a character actor named John McIntyre. And there's a great story that Ward Bond and John Wayne and Andy Devine were the biggest right-wingers in Hollywood.
Oh, yes.
But they were always in John Ford movies, and John Ford was kind of an FDR liberal, if you want to call it that then. And so when Ward Bond died, there was going to be a memorial for it right during John Ford shooting a Western that Andy Devine was in. He said, okay, I'm going this morning. I want you setting up the shot. I don't want any of you else to go. I'll tell you how it is, and be ready for me when I come back, and we'll start shooting. So he goes, and he comes back, and Andy Devine, who's this character, this big fat character guy with a really funny voice, comes up and says, how was Ward's memorial? And John Ford, who was known as a prickly character, said, well, Ward's dead. Now you're the biggest asshole in Hollywood. Let's shoot. Then the other shot on this night, it played in the morning where I live, was The Millionaire. And The Millionaire had this great premise. Marvin Miller was kind of a character actor and an announcer with a great voice. The show would start, you'd meet some like troubled couple in the intro. And then he would look at the camera, Marvin Miller, said, my name is Michael Anthony. And until his death just a few years ago, I was the executive secretary to the late John Beresford Tipton, a fabulously wealthy and fascinating man whose many hobbies included his habit of giving away $1 million tax-free each week to persons he had never even met. So, you see the predicament these people are in. And then this guy shows up in a little bow tie, and he says, I can't, you have to promise not to reveal,
Right.
where you got this from. And $1 million in 1960 is like 9.5 million now. So this is serious coin he's giving out. And then you see how it works out. So it was a great premise, and they had good guest stars and everything like that. And I think Americans love this idea of,
oh yeah, that's the American dream.
Whatever, is who wants to be a millionaire?
Right.
So this I think it might have even started on radio. This show, it was just great format. And even though Marvin Miller, and he really wasn't, he introduced the show and he did the outro and he showed up once and handed over an envelope, and then people ruined their lives because they had too much money.
Right.
Thursday started with another Western, Bat Masterson.
The Whip.
Who was Wyatt Earp's deputy. And this was going on at the same time that The Legend of Wyatt Earp was playing. And there was another actor playing Bat Masterson. So they were kind of dueling Bat Mastersons on. And Gene Barry played this. So it was kind of a debonair actor who wasn't only in Westerns. And his version of Bat Masterson was a bit of a dude. So he carried a gold-topped cane. He wore fancy vests and a derby instead of a cowboy hat. And was kind of a little more erudite. The real Bat Masterson actually was not only a deputy marshal, but a sports promoter. He promoted some of the earliest heavyweight fights.
Oh, wow.
Came to New York and worked for the New York World as a sports writer. And he's the guy who Sky Masterson is based on in Guys and Dolls.
Oh, wow.
He became quite a Broadway figure. And then The Untouchables, which was my favorite show. I know you lived in London, I think, for a while. British people grow up and they know the secessions of kings. Mm-hmm. I grew up knowing the secession of Chicago gangsters. So from Johnny Torrio and Al Capone through Murray the Camel Humphreys and Paul the Waiter Rica, I knew, who took over from who, and the whole deal with Al Capone is that he was Napolitano and not Sicilian. So he was, and it had deteriorated by the time Humphreys came around. There's a Welsh guy running, the mafia in Chicago.
Because Sicilians was La Cosa Nostra, but it
was really just like a neighborhood thing, you know. And you were not in the Unione Siciliano. You weren't really one of the guys.
Right.
And so he was kind of an outsider from New York who came with Johnny Torrio, and they muscled in. But most of the guys working for him were Sicilians, and then they brought the Sicilians back in and the omertà that went with it, and that kind of held reign. So Robert Stack, who, if you started watching TV later, was the host of Unsolved Mysteries, had a great kind of husky
8765353.
Yeah. When I played Ring Lardner and directed the movie 8 Men Out, I played him using Robert Stack's voice.
Good choice.
There was a line in it where I said, "You lied to me, Eddie," and or at least it's Dan Aykroyd doing Robert Stack.
Yes.
And it absolutely filled all the lines that I wrote for that guy. And the other thing that was great about this was the intro and narration by Walter Winchell. Walter Winchell was another TV news columnist who then became a radio guy, and he had this very kind of high staccato way of talking. And his radio show always started with, "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all the ships at sea." And he talked really fast, so he got a lot in, whether it was Broadway gossip or real news. And so here's a little bit of Winchell.
In 1934, Prohibition had been repealed, and the Capone mob, without its leader, serving time at Alcatraz prison, was desperate for new sources of revenue. With the instinct of jackals for an easy kill, they picked the nation's small theater owners for their prey. The type of operation used was one they knew best: extortion. On a quiet street in Oak Park, Illinois, suburb of Chicago, Harold Coleman was closing his theater. Coleman was the owner and operator of 2 small motion picture houses. He thought he hadn't an enemy in the world, but he was soon to learn that he was mistaken. To put their extortion plan into operation, the Capone mob had chosen Frank Nitti, longtime enforcer for Scarface Al Capone.
Neville Brand, who was a wonderful kind of, gravelly voiced character actor who had been, he and Audie Murphy were among the most decorated soldiers in World War II. And
wow.
He played Capone in several episodes and was pretty good at it. And then this kind of thing happened where after the first season, there was some kind of Italian-American anti-defamation society, and they complained that you're making us look bad. Well, come on, guys.
History's making you look bad.
And the TV show totally backed off, so they had to come up with these kind of neutral names.
Mafioso Johnny Smith.
Yeah, exactly. For the guys, and I still liked the show, but it was like, I know who they're really talking about.
Right.
That's Pittsburgh Phil, Giancardi, and that's, Frankie Uwali, Frankie Yale, and whoever it was. And that basically was my favorite show. And it was an hour, and they could really get into things. And when you'd hear Winchell doing his intro, there's a lot of machine guns going and stills being broken up and just general mayhem. But also he could come in and move the plot forward.
Right.
So he could, do exposition as part of the storytelling and really move things ahead. And then Robert Stack could be very terse and, Rico, Youngblood, go do this thing. And his favorite line of mine is some gangster, said he was going to do something to me. He says, "You don't have the moxie." And then people are saying, "What's moxie? I thought it was a soft drink."
From Maine. He's a guy who I always wish did more comedy. Like he has that sort of so deadpan in from what I've heard from people who work with him, was actually a pretty funny guy.
I met him once. My first movie got an award from the Los Angeles Film Critics Committee or whatever association. And they had a TV show where they presented the awards to get like people on television. And all the presenters were people who were in between series.
Right.
So like Fernando Lamas, Dean Martin's son. And
Right.
I remember, what's her name? Nastasia Kinski.
Oh, yeah.
There, because Roman Polanski got an award, but he was already on The Lamb.
Right.
And so she had to accept it for him. And I thought, oh, it's some producer's daughter. She was this little girl in a prom dress. You know?
Right.
So I'm at a table with Robert Stack, who's, introducing my award. And he's the funniest guy. They're kind of hokey jokes. And he had just done 1941. And that started him into the kind of airplane mode of, being the deadpan guy like Leslie Nielsen, who after he started doing, that, you couldn't go back and watch one of his straight parts.
Oh, no, not at all.
Because you can't take anything to seriously. He played the Swamp Fox for Disney, and it's just like, oh, come on, where's the jokes?
It ruined Forbidden Planet for me.
Yeah. I mean, it's Frank Drebin, and you can't get out of it once you've seen it. But yeah, he was actually he had been a skeet shooting champion in one of his early movies. He actually got to shoot skeet, and they could do it in one shot instead of cutting away. But cool guy. Then Friday night, I always watch Friday Night Fights, and they have them here. It was actually, the full name was the Gillette Cavalcade of Sports. And
sounds less violent.
Brought to you by Gillette and Sharpie the Parrot, who was a cartoon parrot. And let's see if I can find a boxing theme.
Gillette Cavalcade of Sports is on the air.
Every time you shave to feel sharp and be on the ball, just be sharp. Use Gillette Blue Blade for the quickest, slickest shaves of all.
Way more upbeat than I'd expect for pugilism.
Yeah, and boxing is perfect for having one sponsor. It's a razor. Guys watch boxing. They have to shave.
Right.
They may have light, regular, or heavy beards.
Right.
So I guess there's a different razor for each. Wonders of technology. And Sharpie the Parrot is dancing around as they're doing their song. And there's 1 minute in between rounds. So you have 3 minutes of action, and then 1 minute to sell razors, and then you're back, watching people knock the shit out of each other.
It's pre-formatted.
On this particular night, what's interesting for me is that Emile Griffith is fighting. And I saw him fight a lot. He's a guy from the Virgin Islands. Incredible build. I mean, it's like the Marvel people drew this guy. Incredible muscles. And he was, early in his career, he was mostly winning, and some by knockouts. He fought a Cuban guy named Benny Paret 3 times, and I was one of the kids at 12 years old watching their third fight when he killed Benny Paret.
In the ring live.
In the ring live.
Paret against the ropes, almost helpless. A minute to go. And they're going to stop it. They're going to stop it as Paret sags to the canvas. Paret goes down from sheer exhaustion. Look at him there. As his handlers put his mouthpiece out. Dr. Schiff is coming over to look at him. Paret has collapsed from exhaustion from that beating on the ropes. And Dr. Alexander Schiff of the Commission is trying to get at him. The fight has been stopped, and the winner and new champion is Emile Griffith, but we're more concerned about the condition of Benny Kid Paret than we are about the title at the moment. We're going to have an interview with the winner. The time is 2:09 of this round. We'll have an interview with Emile Griffith as soon as we find out how Benny Kid Paret is.
The time, 2 minutes and 9 seconds of the 12th round. The winner by a knockout, and once again, welterweight champion of the world.
Emile Griffith was bisexual. not much of a secret, really. And Benny Paret had given him some shit and called him maricon when they were in the, the weigh-in. And so Emile Griffith was out for blood. They had split the other two fights. And at some point, he caught him up against the rope. And the guy's one arm was kind of wrapped around the rope, so he couldn't fall, but he could also not get up. And he hit him about 13 or 14 times with nothing between them and his fist, thinking, well, why isn't he going down?
Right.
And finally, the referee got there and pulled him away. And I still remember him, Benny Paret, slowly oozing to the canvas and me saying, I think he's dead. And he didn't die for another 10 days or so. But, before, seeing Jack Ruby get killed on television, that was the only time I saw somebody got killed on TV.
Right.
The last of them is kind of a classic. And this is The Twilight Zone.
Yeah.
Which I never missed and was pretty new at this time. And Rod Serling, who was the main writer and wrote several of the episodes, never directed any, did this incredible intro.
You unlock this door with the key of imagination. Beyond it is another dimension. A dimension of sound. A dimension of sight. A dimension of mind. You're moving into a land of both shadow and substance, of things and ideas. You've just crossed over into the Twilight Zone.
Sometimes even appear, and he, there'd be a little intro scenelet, and then he'd appear again, and he'd introduce the episode and say, witness so-and-so, and this is... strange shit's going to happen to him.
Yeah.
And it was my introduction to irony, because it always ended ironically. So if Burgess Meredith played the guy who was a bookworm who loved to read, and everybody else gets killed except for him, and he goes in the library and he says, oh, isn't this wonderful? Nobody's going to bother me. Of course, he drops his glasses and steps on them.
Yes.
And can't find his way out to another optician shop, I guess.
He's going to smelt his own lenses.
Yeah, and some of them were kind of grisly, some were funny, some were very advanced science fiction, but they always had this kind of twist at the end, which, as a kind of burgeoning writer, is, oh, I get it. That's how much irony you can get away with in 22 minutes. And wonderful guest stars,
oh yeah,
Robert Redford, and people who became famous actors later, and then a lot of people who basically stayed in TV and they're familiar, but you don't really know your names.
Yeah, that's a show that I feel like made us all better people. I would say, because of the allegory.
Well, the quality was high for one thing.
Mm.
They later made a feature based on one of Serling's episodes got turned into Requiem for a Heavyweight.
Mm-hmm.
That was on Playhouse 90. But there was a Twilight Zone called Steel that Lee Marvin was in, and he plays a guy, and it's kind of in the future, and they've banned real boxing, but people have lifelike machines that they box, and they have this old model, and it's breaking down, and they just want to get one more fight out of it, and they've booked a fight, and the thing breaks apart, but they're going to get kicked out of the boxing business if they don't show up for this date and miss the bout. And so Lee Marvin says, well, look, I can last 3 rounds. I'll just pretend to be, and it's called Steel. And he goes out there and takes the beating of his life. So it's like a Hemingway story. There's a wonderful Hemingway story called 50 Grand, where a guy who thinks he's going to lose, he's the champ, but he knows he's getting old and he's going to lose to this young kid, takes 50 grand to throw the fight. And in the first round, he taps this guy, and the guy almost goes down, and he has to hold him up for the 3 rounds. And then, basically decides, well, I'm not going to look bad this punk doesn't deserve the championship. So he hauls off and hits him in the balls with an undercup. He's qualified. So he at least gets the satisfaction of seeing the guy taken off.
Everybody wins.
And he, he gets the 50 grand and he doesn't look bad. And, but the quality once again was very high, like Alfred Hitchcock, even though it was, just kind of regular TV.
Yeah.
So that was pretty much, and then my parents would go to bed, and like you, I would get up again and keep the volume low to see what weird shit going on, And it only came on until midnight in 1960, and then there was a test pattern.
A patriotic sign-off too. That was
they would have the Star Spangled Banner and a lot of missiles and things like that, and or else they would have. A lot of aircraft and rockets, and a guy kind of talking in italics doing this poem. I have slipped the surly bonds of sleep. And, and that would be the end. And then the test pattern, and you look at the test pattern until you said, well, I got to go to sleep now.
Have you seen Ted Turner's completely sincere sign-off for the end of the world that he made?
Oh, no, in case it really happened.
Yeah, so when CNN started, he had them make basically like a tape to play on Doomsday to sign off. And someone leaked it a couple of years ago. And it's basically everything you described, except it's 1985 or 6. And it's like, well, we had a good run, everybody. Like, it's so weird.
You have footage from the Atlanta Braves when they were winning a World Series and doing the job. Oh, God.
Did it all. Thank you so much. I appreciate you doing this. And
I love the series.
Oh, thank you.
Interesting to see. There's a lot of stuff I never saw. And some of it I might even try to track down.
Oh, yeah.
And some of it I have been warned against. So.
Well, I'd love to hear what you think if you track any of it down. That was John. I mean, what else can I say? What an amazing guy. I, again, cannot thank him enough for taking the time to talk with me about classic television. We didn't even get into Square One TV, which, I'll have to talk to him about at some point in the future. And just so much amazing work that he's done. Thank you guys so much for listening to the show. Truly, I mean that. It's we're almost at episode 500 here. I think we're 10 away. I cannot believe I've done 500 episodes of this show, but I'm still enjoying it, still having great guests, and still blown away by the people I get to talk to as guests on the show or listeners. I love hearing from you guys. So until next week, I'll see you then for a brand new edition of TV Guidance Counselor.
You lied to me, Eddie.